The 8-year-old boy froze mid-step, his backpack sliding from his shoulder to the concrete. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only the sharp intake of breath that happens when reality shifts so suddenly that the mind can't catch up. His small hands trembled as they reached toward something. Someone who shouldn't be there. The schoolyard continued its usual chaos around him. Children ran past. Teachers called out instructions. Car doors slammed in the pickup line. But for this child, the world had narrowed to a single point of focus. A figure standing 20 feet away, partially hidden behind the chain-link fence. His eyes filled with tears before his brain could process why. The uniform was unmistakable, even from a distance. Desert camouflage, boots polished despite months of wear, a duffel bag dropped carelessly at strong feet. But it was the smile, that familiar, weathered smile he'd been dreaming about for 7 months, that finally broke through his shock. The word escaped as barely a whisper, lost in the afternoon din. He blinked hard, afraid that if he looked away for even a second, the mirage would disappear like all the other times he'd imagined this moment. The man in uniform stepped forward, and suddenly the boy was running, his backpack forgotten, his careful walk home abandoned. Because sometimes, when you've been waiting long enough, your heart recognizes home before your eyes do. But how did his father get here? And why was his mother nowhere to be found? 7 months. That's how long 8-year-old Tommy had been counting days on the calendar his mother hung in the kitchen, each X marking another sunset without his father's voice calling him for dinner, another bedtime story read by someone else, another morning without the sound of combat boots on the hardwood floor. Staff Sergeant Michael Choon had deployed to Afghanistan in February, when the winter snow still clung to their small Ohio town like a stubborn reminder of the cold months ahead. Tommy remembered that morning with painful clarity, how his father had knelt down in their driveway, his hands gentle on Tommy's shoulders, promising that he'd be back before the boy knew it. "Take care of your mum for me, soldier," he'd said, using the nickname that always made Tommy stand a little taller. The house had changed in his absence. Not just the obvious things, the empty chair at the dinner table, the unused coffee mug that his mother couldn't bring herself to put away, the unmade side of the bed that she pretended didn't matter. It was the smaller details that revealed the depth of their longing. Tommy's drawings, once filled with stick figures of complete families, now showed houses with only 2 people. His mother, Sarah, had developed the habit of leaving the porch light on every single night, as if her husband might suddenly appear in their driveway at any moment. The routine of pickup had become sacred to them both. Every school day at 3:15 p.m., Sarah would park her Honda Civic in the same spot along Maple Street, and Tommy would scan the crowd until he found her familiar face. She'd wave, he'd run to the car, and they'd drive home in comfortable silence, both of them carrying the weight of one missing conversation, one absent laugh. But today was different, though Tommy didn't know why yet. This morning, his mother had seemed lighter, somehow. She'd hummed while making his lunch, kissed his forehead twice instead of once, and told him to pay extra attention to everything that happens after school. He'd assumed she meant his math test results. What he didn't know was that Sarah had been planning this moment for 3 weeks. Ever since Michael's commanding officer had called with news of his early return, the surprise had been orchestrated with military precision, fake errands to keep Tommy occupied, secret phone calls made while he was at soccer practice, and a carefully constructed lie about her needing to run a quick errand, and sending Aunt Lisa to pick you up. Tommy had never met Aunt Lisa, but as he stood frozen in that schoolyard, staring at the impossible figure in desert camouflage, he realized that some surprises are worth every carefully crafted deception. The waiting had its own rhythm, a cadence that had settled into their bones like an ache that becomes familiar. For Sarah, it began each morning at 5:47 a.m. the exact time Michael used to wake up for his morning run. She'd learned to sleep through that invisible alarm, but her body still stirred, still reached across cool sheets to find emptiness. Tommy's bedroom wall told the story of their separation in crayon and colored pencil. A timeline of drawings that started hopeful Daddy in his uniform waving goodbye from an airplane and gradually evolved into something more complex. By month 3, his artwork showed soldiers behind walls. By month 5, the figures had grown smaller, more distant. The most recent drawing, completed just last week, showed a boy standing alone in a schoolyard, looking up at an empty sky. The dinner table had become a geography lesson in loneliness. Sarah would set 2 plates, then catch herself reaching for a third. Tommy would save the last bite of everything: cookies, pizza, even vegetables he didn't like, explaining to his mother that Daddy might want some when he gets home. She never had the heart to tell him that food doesn't wait 7 months. Letters arrived sporadically, each one worn thin from multiple readings. Michael's handwriting had grown more careful over time, as if he was choosing each word to carry maximum weight across continents. "Tommy is getting so tall in the pictures you send," he'd write. "I keep forgetting he won't be the same little boy when I get back." The letters lived in a shoebox under Sarah's bed, organized by date, each one a small time capsule of love preserved in blue ink. The hardest moments were the unexpected ones. When Tommy's bike chain broke, and he instinctively called out, "Dad, can you fix this?" Before remembering when Sarah found herself cooking Michael's favorite meal on a Tuesday, then eating it alone while staring at his empty chair. When other families at school events appeared complete, and their absence felt like a spotlight following them through crowds. Tommy had developed rituals of his own. Every night, before bed, he'd stand at his bedroom window facing east, the direction his mother had told him Daddy was, and whisper good morning, because it was tomorrow where his father was. He'd learned about time zones the hard way, through the mathematics of missing someone. He kept a small American flag in his backpack, folded exactly the way his father had taught him, for protection, though he'd never explained protection from what. The phone calls were both salvation and torture. Scheduled for Sunday evenings, when the time difference aligned, they'd gather around Sarah's laptop, the screen flickering with poor connection and showing glimpses of a man who looked like Michael but somehow smaller, grainier, further away than the thousands of miles between them. Tommy would save up stories all week: playground victories, lost teeth, new words learned only to freeze when his father's pixelated face appeared. Love, it turned out, was harder to transmit through fiber optic cables. Sarah had grown fluent in the language of deployment wives. She knew which grocery store aisles to avoid the one with his favorite cereal, which songs to skip on the radio, anything that mentioned coming home, and which questions from well-meaning neighbors required which carefully rehearsed responses. "How are you holding up?" was answered with taking it one day at a time. "When does he come back?" received soon, we hope. The truth that she was drowning in ordinary moments made extraordinary. His absence wasn't suitable for casual conversation. But today, as Tommy sat in his third-period math class, practicing multiplication tables that felt as endless as deployment, Sarah was 40 miles away at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, her hands shaking as she signed visitor logs and followed a sergeant through corridors that smelled like industrial cleaning, solution, and possibility. Today, the waiting would finally end. Staff Sergeant Michael Chun had memorized every detail of his son's face from photographs. But memory, he'd learned, was a traitor. It softened edges, blurred timelines, and made 8-year-olds seem frozen in amber while real children grew inches and lost teeth and learned to tie their shoes without their father's clumsy fingers helping. The flight home had been 23 hours of controlled anxiety. He'd sat in that cramped military transport, his duffel bag wedged between his knees, fingering the stack of letters Tommy had sent over the months. Each one was carefully preserved in a waterproof pouch, insurance against the desert dust that had claimed so many other precious things. "Dear Daddy," they all began, and his heart would clench every single time, because somewhere between Dear and Daddy lived 7 months of a childhood he'd never get back. Afghanistan had taught him to compartmentalize everything except love. You put fear in one box, duty in another, homesickness in a third, and you stacked them carefully in the corners of your mind where they couldn't interfere with keeping yourself and your squad alive. But love was different. Love was the photograph of Tommy's gap-toothed smile taped inside his helmet, the recording of Sarah's voice on his phone that he played every night before sleep, the small American flag his son had given him that he carried in his breast pocket during every mission. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent months protecting other people's children, watching Afghan kids play soccer in dusty streets while missing his own son's Little League games. He'd handed out candy to children who looked at him with curiosity rather than recognition, while somewhere in Ohio, his own child was learning to ride a bike without his steadying hand on the seat. The nightmares were standard deployment fare, but the dreams were worse. Dreams of coming home to find Tommy had forgotten his voice, had grown comfortable with his absence, had learned to be happy without him. Dreams where he knocked on his own front door and no one answered. Dreams where he arrived home to find his spot at the dinner table had been permanently removed, his coffee mug donated to charity, his side of the bed reclaimed by throw pillows. Sarah's letters had been his lifeline and his torture. She wrote about Tommy's soccer games with the forced cheer of someone trying to fill silence with words, but between the lines he could read her exhaustion. "Tommy asked me to help him with his Pinewood derby car," she'd written in March. "I tried, but my hands aren't as steady as yours. We did our best." That night, he'd cried for the first time since deployment, mourning a wooden car he'd never helped build. The phone calls were scheduled torture, watching his family through a pixelated screen, trying to parent through lag time and frozen frames, reduced to asking, "Can you hear me?" more often than "I love you." Tommy would hold up drawings to the camera, artwork that looked like abstract color through the poor connection, and Michael would nod and smile and pretend he could see every crayon stroke clearly. 3 weeks ago, when his commanding officer had called him into the tent that served as their field office, Michael had braced himself for bad news. "Chun, you're going home early," were the most beautiful words he'd heard in 7 months. Early return due to mission completion. Not injury, not emergency, but genuine good news that felt as foreign as the Afghan landscape around him. The surprise had been Sarah's idea, coordinated through encrypted emails and carefully timed phone calls to relatives who could help maintain the deception. "I want his face to show pure joy," she'd written, "not the careful preparation for disappointment that we've all gotten too good at." Michael understood. They'd all learned to temper expectations, to prepare for delays, extensions, complications. Pure joy had become a luxury they couldn't afford. Now, standing behind the chain-link fence of Tommy's elementary school, watching his son walk toward the pickup area with the same careful posture he'd developed, shoulders just slightly hunched, as if carrying invisible weight, Michael felt his own careful emotional armor cracking. This was his boy, taller than the photographs suggested, moving with a caution that broke his father's heart. This was the child who'd learned to be brave without him. The final school bell at 3:15 p.m. rang with the same metallic finality it always did. But today, the sound seemed to echo longer, carrying more weight. Tommy gathered his pencils with the methodical precision he'd developed over months of waiting everything in its place. Everything controlled, because some things could be controlled even when fathers couldn't come home on schedule. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed him lingering by his desk. "Your mom running late today, Tommy?" she asked, glancing at the clock. It wasn't unusual. Sarah had been 5 or 10 minutes behind schedule more frequently lately, as if punctuality had become another casualty of their family's disrupted rhythm. "She said Lisa might pick me up," Tommy replied, shouldering his backpack. The lie felt strange in his mouth, because he'd never mentioned Aunt Lisa before, had never needed to. But his mother had been insistent that morning, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like mischief. "Just in case I get held up at work," she'd said, though she'd never been held up at work before. Outside, the usual controlled chaos of pickup time was in full swing. Cars lined Maple Street in their familiar hierarchy, the punctual parents in front, the perpetually late ones circling the block. Tommy walked his practiced route toward the spot where his mother's Honda Civic should be waiting, his eyes automatically scanning for her face among the crowd of adults checking phones and calling out to children. But the Honda wasn't there. For a moment, panic fluttered in his chest, the kind of fear that had become his constant companion, the whisper that said maybe this time someone else wouldn't come back either. He stopped walking, other children flowing around him like water around a stone, all of them moving toward waiting arms that were guaranteed to be there. That's when he saw the figure by the fence. At first, it was just a shape that didn't belong, too tall, too still, positioned wrong for a typical pickup. The afternoon sun was behind the person, creating a silhouette that Tommy's brain couldn't immediately categorize. Not a mother in yoga pants, checking her phone. Not a father in a business suit, glancing at his watch. This person was simply ... standing, watching, waiting with the kind of stillness that soldiers learn. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched his son's confused face. The boy was looking right at him, but hadn't recognized him yet. 7 months of absence, creating a gap between memory and reality that recognition couldn't immediately bridge. Tommy was taller, as Sarah had promised in her letters, but also somehow older in ways that had nothing to do with inches. There was a carefulness in his movements, a practiced scanning of faces that no 8-year-old should need to master. The desert camouflage uniform felt foreign on American soil, too heavy for an Ohio September, but Michael hadn't wanted to change. This was how Tommy would remember him leaving. This was how he wanted to return. The duffel bag at his feet contained 7 months of accumulated longing, letters never sent, gifts purchased from military exchanges, a wooden toy helicopter carved during endless desert nights when sleep wouldn't come. Other parents were beginning to notice him now. A few mothers whispered to each other, their eyes softening with recognition of what his uniform meant. One father, a veteran himself, based on his posture, caught Michael's eye and nodded a silent communication between men who understood the weight of homecoming. Tommy had stopped moving entirely now, standing 15 feet away, his small face cycling through confusion, hope, and something that looked dangerously close to fear. Michael understood that fear. It was the same emotion that had kept him awake during their last phone call, the terror that 7 months might have been too long, that love might not survive the mathematics of separation. The schoolyard sounds seemed to fade, children's laughter becoming distant, car doors closing like whispers. Time stretched the way it does in dreams, each second expanding to hold more weight than seconds were designed to carry. Michael took 1 step forward, then stopped, giving his son time to process, to believe, to choose. Tommy's backpack slipped from his shoulder, hitting the concrete with a soft thud that somehow seemed louder than all the other noise around them. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Michael could see the exact moment recognition bloomed across his son's face. The widening eyes, the sharp intake of breath, the trembling that started in his hands and spread outward. "Daddy." The word was barely audible, lost in the afternoon air, but Michael heard it as clearly as if Tommy had shouted. 7 months of missing that voice. 7 months of wondering if he'd forgotten the precise pitch of his son's calling. And now here it was different than memory, deeper somehow, but unmistakably, heartbreakingly familiar. Other children were starting to notice now their own pickup routines, pausing as they sensed the electric tension building between the man in uniform and the boy who'd gone. Statue still, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, drawn by some teacher's instinct that told her something significant was happening in her schoolyard. Michael smiled, the same crooked smile Tommy had inherited, the one Sarah had fallen in love with 15 years ago, the one that lived in photographs, taped inside military helmets, and tucked into shoebox collections of love letters. He raised one hand in a tentative wave, and that simple gesture broke the spell that had frozen them both in place. "Tommy, run." The 20 feet between them collapsed in heartbeats, but each step felt suspended in amber, crystallized into a moment that would replay in both their memories for the rest of their lives. Tommy's sneakers slapped against concrete in an irregular rhythm, not the steady pace of a track star, but the desperate, stumbling run of a child whose carefully constructed world had just been shattered and rebuilt in the span of a breath. Michael dropped to one knee, his arms opening wide, muscle memory from 1,000 bedtime routines and playground catches taking over where conscious thought had abandoned him. The duffel bag toppled over behind him, forgotten, spilling its contents of love letters and carved toys onto the asphalt. Nothing mattered except the small body hurtling toward him, backpack forgotten somewhere in the distance, school papers floating like confetti in Tommy's wake. The impact nearly knocked Michael backward. Tommy crashed into him with the full force of 7 months' worth of stored embraces, his thin arms wrapping around his father's neck, with a desperation that spoke of nightmares where people left and never returned. Michael's own arms encircled his son, and he was shocked at how much heavier Tommy felt, how his shoulder blades had sharpened, how his legs had grown long enough to wrap completely around his father's waist. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," Tommy whispered into Michael's neck, the word becoming a prayer, a mantra, a spell to keep this moment from dissolving like all the dreams that had come before. His small hands fisted in the rough fabric of the desert camouflage, holding on with the grip of someone who'd learned that letting go could mean losing everything. Michael buried his face in his son's hair, breathing in the scent that no photograph could capture, no video call could transmit, that unique combination of childhood shampoo and playground dust and something indefinably Tommy that had haunted his dreams for months. The boy smelled different somehow, older, but underneath the changes was the same essence that had been Michael's anchor through 7 months of sandstorms and loneliness. "I'm here, buddy." "I'm here," Michael murmured, his voice breaking on the words. His own tears came without warning, hot and immediate, the kind of crying he'd forbidden himself in the desert because tears were a luxury that could compromise focus, could make weapons shake in hands that needed to stay steady. But here, now, with his son's heart beating against his chest, tears were the only language adequate for this homecoming. Around them, the schoolyard had gone quiet. Other families paused their own reunions to witness this one, understanding instinctively that they were watching something sacred. Mrs. Rodriguez stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her heart, her own eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. The veteran father who'd nodded earlier was openly crying now, his own children forgotten as he lived vicariously through Michael's joy. Tommy pulled back just enough to study his father's face, his small hands framing Michael's cheeks with the gravity of a scientist examining a precious specimen. "You're really here," he said. Not a question, but a statement requiring confirmation. His fingers tracing the new lines around his father's eyes, the deeper tan, the subtle changes that 7 months of desert sun had carved into familiar features. "I'm really here," Michael confirmed, his thumbs brushing away the tears streaking his son's face. "I'm home, dummy. I'm finally home. But where's Mom? She was supposed to pick me up. and I was scared when she wasn't here. And then I saw you, and I thought maybe I was dreaming again, because sometimes I dream you come home, but then I wake up and you're still gone. And hey, Michael interrupted gently, pressing his forehead against Tommy's. Mom knows I'm here. She helped plan this whole surprise. She wanted it to be perfect for you. Tommy's eyes widened with the realization that his mother had been complicit in this miracle, that her strange cheerfulness that morning had been the prelude to the best secret in the world. She knew, and she didn't tell me. She wanted to see your face when you realized, Michael explained, standing slowly with Tommy still clinging to him, unwilling to let even gravity separate them. She wanted this moment to be just for us first. The weight of his son in his arms felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if his body had been recalibrating itself for this specific burden for 7 months. Tommy was heavier than when he'd left, but Michael was stronger too, not just from months of military training, but from the kind of strength that comes from having something worth coming home to. Are you staying this time? Tommy asked, his voice small against Michael's ear. Really staying? Not just for a visit. The question pierced Michael's heart because it revealed how much his 8-year-old had learned about the impermanence of happiness, about the difference between visits and permanence, about the way military families lived in the spaces between deployments. I'm staying, Michael promised, the words feeling like a vow, like a contract written in love and sealed with tears. I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. Not for a long time. Tommy's sob of relief was muffled against his father's shoulder, but Michael felt it reverberating through his own chest, a sound that would echo in his heart for years to come. This was the moment he'd dreamed of through every dusty sunrise in Afghanistan, through every night patrol and every video call that cut out at the worst possible moment. This was home, not the house on Maple Street, not even Sarah's embrace, but this weight in his arms, this trust, this complete and utter faith that Daddy had kept his promise to come back. The schoolyard gradually returned to life around them, but father and son remained locked in their embrace, making up for 7 months of missed hugs in a single, endless moment that felt both eternal and far too brief. 20 minutes later, they sat together on the school's front steps, Tommy still pressed against his father's side as if proximity alone could prevent another separation. Michael's arm remained wrapped around his son, his hand unconsciously stroking Tommy's hair in a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign muscle memory, returning after months of disuse. The schoolyard had mostly emptied now, other families having completed their ordinary pickups and driven home to ordinary dinners where no one counted days on calendars or saved the last bite of everything. But Mrs. Rodriguez lingered, giving them space while staying close enough to ensure this reunion didn't end too abruptly. She understood, perhaps better than most, that some moments need protection from the rushing world. "Tell me about soccer," Michael said, his voice still slightly hoarse from tears. "Mom wrote that you scored 3 goals in 1 game. Tommy's face lit up with the particular joy of a child who has stories to share and finally has the right audience for them. "It was against the Eagles, and Coach Martinez said I ran like lightning, and Billy Henderson said his dad thinks I might make varsity when I get to high school, and—" The words tumbled out in the breathless rush of someone who has been saving up conversations for months. Michael listened with the intensity of a man who'd learned that no detail was too small when filtered through love. He absorbed every word about goals scored and homework completed and friends made, filing each story away like precious artifacts. This was what he'd missed. He realized not just the big moments that made it into letters and phone calls, but the small, ordinary magic of daily life shared between father and son. "I drew pictures of you," Tommy said suddenly, his voice growing quiet. "Lots of pictures. Mom put them on the refrigerator, but I kept some in my room too. I drew you coming home in different ways, sometimes in a plane, sometimes in a car, sometimes just walking up our driveway. But I never drew you here, at school." He looked up at his father with wonder. "This is better than any picture I made." The observation hit Michael with unexpected force. Children, he reflected, are natural philosophers, capable of profound truths delivered with startling simplicity. Tommy had unknowingly articulated something that Michael himself had struggled to understand, that reality, when it finally arrives, has a texture and weight that imagination can never quite capture. "I kept all your letters," Michael told him. "Every single one. I read them so many times that some of the ink started to fade, but I could recite them from memory anyway." He pulled the waterproof pouch from his cargo pocket, showing Tommy the stack of carefully preserved correspondence. "These kept me going on the hardest days." Tommy reached for the letters with reverent fingers, touching them as if they were sacred objects. In a way, Michael supposed, they were. Each one represented an attempt to bridge an impossible distance. Love transmitted through paper and ink, and faith that someone thousands of miles away would understand the weight of words chosen by an 8-year-old heart. The September afternoon was cooling, painting everything in golden light that photographers call magic hour. Michael thought about all the sunsets he'd watched in Afghanistan, all the times he'd wondered what the light looked like falling across Tommy's face at this same moment. Now he knew. It turned his son's brown eyes amber, highlighted the freckles that had multiplied over the summer, cast shadows that emphasized how much his face had lengthened and matured. "Are you different now?" Tommy asked with the directness that only children possess. Mom said sometimes people change when they go away for a long time. Michael considered the question seriously, because Tommy deserved serious answers to serious questions. "I think I'm the same person who loves you exactly as much as before," he said finally. "Maybe I understand that love better now. Maybe I know how precious ordinary days are. But the important parts, the daddy parts, those are exactly the same." Tommy seemed to find this answer acceptable, snuggling closer as if to test the truth of it through physical proximity. "I was scared you might forget what I looked like," he admitted. "Sometimes I looked in the mirror and tried to practice what I'd say when you came home. But then I worried that maybe I looked too different and you wouldn't recognize me." "I would always recognize you," Michael said with absolute certainty. "You could grow 10 feet tall and I'd still know you were my son." Some things don't change, no matter how much time passes. The sound of a car approaching made them both look up. Sarah's Honda Civic pulled into the now empty parking lot, and through the windshield, Michael could see his wife's face, radiant with the particular joy that comes from orchestrating perfect moments. She'd given them this time, this space, this private reunion before claiming her own piece of the homecoming. "There's Mom," Tommy said, but he made no move to leave his father's side. "She cried this morning when she thought I wasn't looking." "Happy crying, I think." "Probably happy crying," Michael agreed, standing and lifting Tommy with him. "Come on, let's go give her the biggest hug she's ever had." As they walked towards Sarah's car, Tommy still wrapped around his father like a koala. Michael felt the weight of homecoming settle into his bones. This was what he'd fought for, trained for, survived for, not the abstract concepts of freedom and democracy that filled military speeches, but this specific weight in his arms, this particular love in this ordinary September afternoon, this family that had waited and hoped and counted days until their soldier came home. Some stories, Michael realized, don't have dramatic endings. They have new beginnings disguised as conclusions, homecomings that feel like the first page of a book rather than the last. Today wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of ordinary days made extraordinary by presence, of bedtime stories told in person, of coffee shared while Tommy practiced multiplication tables at the kitchen table. This was the gift of service. Not the glory, but the gratitude. Not the heroism, but the homecoming. Not the sacrifice, but the return to everything that made sacrifice worthwhile. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the weight of waiting and the miracle of reunion, please subscribe and join us for more stories that celebrate the quiet heroism of families who serve together, who wait together, who welcome each other home with tears of joy that speak louder than any words ever could.